che avevamo iniziato ancora a metà giugno, con una serie di 7 appuntamenti sulle tematiche della GIScience, e oggi abbiamo con noi Michael Hodgson, che è direttore del Dipartimento di Geografia della South Carolina University, anzi University of South Carolina a Columbia, e si occupa da moltissimi anni di GIScience e diverse applicazioni della GIScience in diversi ambiti della geografia. Il Dipartimento di Geografia dell'Università di South Carolina sostanzialmente si occupa di 4 aree: una è la geografia umana, un'area è la geografia fisica, un'area di relazioni tra società e ambiente e poi un filone sulla GIScience. Michael si è occupato da moltissimi anni di rischi, gestione del rischio, sempre applicando la tecnologia GIS, più recentemente LIDAR, e diciamo siamo nell'ambito delle diverse applicazioni della GIScience. Oggi ci presenterà un po' com'è la situazione negli Stati Uniti nell'ambito droni e GIS, e in quest'ultimo anno si è occupato anche di testare la normativa degli Stati Uniti sull'uso dei droni in campo scientifico, e quindi ci darà uno sguardo, ci aiuterà ad avere uno sguardo interessante su quelle che possono essere le potenzialità di lavoro diciamo a medio e lungo termine, non solo negli Stati Uniti ma anche a livello internazionale, anche se il mercato degli Stati Uniti per le geospatial knowledge o competenze è sicuramente un mercato interessante, dove già si sta facendo molte sperimentazioni che magari noi cominciamo a vedere. Ecco, quindi do la parola a Michael e vi auguro un buon pomeriggio.
Thank you very much. I will speak in English if that's okay for all. I've always said this when I come to visit here, is when I speak in English, I know most of you can hear and understand me very well. Unlike US students who can speak in English and no other language. So you are much farther ahead than most of the students in the United States. I'm going to we'll try to play this one video, see if it will play. How many of you have an unmanned aerial vehicle, or a drone, we call it? Does anybody have one? How many of you want one? My guess is that if you're a male, you really want one, but you don't want to admit it. But I was the chair of a committee 2 years ago on our university campus to see, it won't play here. I was the chair of a committee 2 years ago to try to solve a problem that we have in the United States, and that's to allow faculty, professors, and their students to fly drones, okay, for educational purposes and for research purposes. The problem is that the United States has a long history of controlling what's called the airspace. Okay? Airspace is anything above the ground. And drones didn't fit in that airspace legally, and so the laws prohibited someone from flying an unmanned aerial vehicle, or what we call a drone, unless they went to a club property, a designated area. And so when the notion of quadcopters and octocopters came out, it suddenly changed the availability of airplanes that individuals could fly and not crash. And so we started down this track of, we started down this path of trying to find a legal solution for allowing our faculty and students to fly. And then in August of 2016, the US government changed the way that they regulate drones. Okay? And they allow drones to be flown under certain conditions. I know they're regulated also in Italy, and I'll talk a little bit about the regulations in the United States. Do you know where the word drone came from? Well, drone really emanated from the British, okay, between the First World War and the Second World War. They created a combination of two different airplanes that they called the Queen Bee. And it did not have a person flying it. It was controlled by radio. And the purpose was simply the plane would fly along on a prescribed course, and it was used as practice for the people on the ground shooting guns at it. And so they would lose a number of these if the gunners were successful at it. Well, the Queen Bee later was named drone because the idea behind the drone is that a drone doesn't do much of anything except impregnate the queen. And you know, they're pretty much mindless individuals. And so the drone that was used for practice was a mindless airplane, and it would fly along and be shot at, just like the drones, you know, serve their purpose. So a drone is a remote controlled aircraft to be used as a target. That's where the word came from. It changed in the 1960s, a lot of the reasons because the US government was coming up with solutions for the Soviet submarines. They regarded those as a significant threat. And while they could detect a Soviet submarine, what they wanted to be able to do was to act against the Soviet submarine if needed from a long distance. And so they created another drone, okay? And this is really it's a helicopter with two torpedoes on the bottom of it. And the drone would fly out to where the submarine was at, and it could launch the torpedoes, and the submarine would never know that it existed. So we've moved from a drone which is being shot at, okay, it's a defensive weapon, to an attack weapon. So we have a change in the way the US government looked at drones. Also, this was the first time that something called first-person view was used on a drone. Okay? So a first-person view means that the person operating the drone could look through the camera on the drone and see what it sees. It could control it from a distance. So we have a number of different military uses, not only in the United States, but many other countries, for using drones for target practice, for combat missions to actually carry munitions, and then for reconnaissance purposes, for battlefield intelligence. Okay? And a lot of individuals are using that. This is one of the largest drones that the US has. It's called the Global Hawk. And there's not as many of these as we have some of the other ones. Okay, so what I want to do is to talk a little bit about what a UAV is, the terminology. There's three different terms that are used in the literature and that are used in the popular media: UAV, UAS, and SUAS. Okay? Yeah. As I talk along, if I'm speaking too fast, or if there's something that you don't understand, just ask me. Okay? This is a small group, and so we can have an interactive kind of discussion. So, and I usually do that with all of my classes, by the way. So. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about the differences between a manned aircraft and a unmanned aerial system. Unmanned aerial systems fill a place, you know, in the research and the applications landscape that manned aircraft were not able to fill. I'll talk about a little bit small unmanned aerial systems, and then I'll talk about federal regulations. The federal regulations in the United States and in other countries are right now the biggest impediment to using drones for a multitude of applications. The bottom button. I can use that one. Okay. No problem. Okay, so terminology. UAV is an unmanned aerial vehicle. UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle. UAS is an unmanned aerial system. Okay? So the UAV is part of the system. Okay? And so you'll see those two terms used a lot in the literature. And then the one that's becoming more common in the last 10 years is the one called the SUAS. S means small, little. Okay? And there's different range of little to large unmanned aerial systems. Here's one of the smaller unmanned aerial vehicles. It's called a nano drone here. This is a new drone that DJI just came out with called a Spark. This one will cost you 20 euro. This one's 500 euro. And this one's many thousand euro. Okay, it's one of the larger drones, and that's Sylvia standing beside it to give you an idea of the scale. And then this is the Icona Predator aircraft, which was developed for military purposes, but it's used now by NASA for surveillance on forest fires, which occur in the western United States. What's emerged as kind of a division between small unmanned aerial systems and unmanned aerial systems in vehicles is this magic number here, 0.55 pounds. Does anybody know how many kilograms 0.55 pounds is?
0.4.
0.4? Is that right?
I don't know.
I just calculated it's 0.25. Is that right? 0.25 kilogram? A quarter of a kilogram is a half a pound, right? 1 pound is a half a kilogram, more or less. Yeah. So it's 0.55, okay, pounds. I don't know why the federal government in the United States decided on 0.55. Okay? That's a big question, so why they did that. If the unmanned aerial vehicle weighs 0.55 pounds or less, in the United States, it does not need to be registered. If it weighs more than that, it must be registered by federal law. Now, that doesn't mean you can fly a small drone in the national airspace legally. Okay? It doesn't mean that. It just means that you have to register it if it's larger. Okay. So we're talking about unmanned aerial systems, UASs, and the three parts of an unmanned aerial system is the vehicle, unmanned aerial vehicle, the control on the ground, okay, and then the communications link between the ground control and the unmanned aerial vehicle. Does anybody know what this guy is doing? Is he watching videos? What do you think he's doing? He's spying on his girlfriend? He's looking through... No, he's actually seeing exactly what the drone is seeing. The camera video is sending that information back to him, and he's looking at it. And he can actually control the drone. In fact, the new drone that came out by DJI called the Spark, it changes direction based upon your head movements. So if you want it to go left, you turn your head left, right. You know, that's how you actually can control it. So he's seeing what the drone actually sees in there. So this is the system. Okay? And if you go out and buy a drone, you have to think about all these parts of the system. I've listed here just some of the key components that are on a drone. Okay? There are probably about 15 or 20 really important ones. I look at these as by far and away for mapping purposes. These are very, very important parts of the system. The accelerometer, if you go out and buy a drone, the cheap ones won't have an accelerometer on them. And the accelerometer controls the attitude of the aircraft, okay? Particularly when there's wind associated with it. The gyroscope is also part of that. The GPS, the manufacturers always say the drone has a GPS. Well, today that means the drone can track itself with GPS and with GLONASS signals, okay? And hopefully someday the European Galileo system as well. Almost all of them have some kind of camera, usually a color camera or a low-resolution video system. Okay. Some of them are emerging now. You can get near-infrared systems on it, and this is you can't buy these off the shelf hyperspectral thermal or lidar systems. In fact, the lidar puck they call it that would go on them is about 10 euro. Gimbals are extremely important if you're interested in taking pictures of the Earth's surface. Okay. A gimbal controls the attitude of the camera. Okay. And you can imagine if the drone is flying along and it's moving like this and the camera's pointing down, well, the camera moves like this. Well, the gimbal actually keeps it pointed in the direction that you want it to, regardless of the orientation of the aircraft. So it's important that if you buy one with the gimbal on it. So all these things come together, control the flight time, the flight distance, whether the drone can fly autonomously, okay, it can fly a track and come back. And then the characteristics of the imagery, which is what we're normally interested in, the quality of the imagery and the spatial spectral resolution. Okay, ground control. Oops, I missed one there. There's two ways of controlling a drone. One's called the visual line of sight. You're watching the drone fly through the air, and you have some controller or your smartphone, and you're controlling the drone by watching it with your eyes. Okay? And the other way that's becoming more popular is called first-person view. And you're wearing a set of goggles, and the video camera on the drone is coming back to you. And you're seeing what the camera on the drone sees. And you control it, okay, by looking out through its camera. Okay, now, I was going to show you a video a minute ago that doesn't display on the screen, but it's called drone racing. Okay, and you can imagine having a little drone that moves at 100 miles per hour, okay, 160 kilometers per hour, and you want to race this thing in some kind of area that you don't want to hit anybody or anything with. Okay, and that's the new sport that's emerged, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. Okay. Okay, the last part is the ground to UAV communication. And that's basically what's happening is the flight control characteristics of the drone is being controlled by this guy here, sending the signal to the drone, and then the video feed from the drone is coming back to the individual so he can see what the drone sees. In some cases, the video and the imagery are stored on the drone itself in a little microchip. In other cases, the video comes back and you have to store it with your controller there. So there has to be a communication between the drone and the individual unless it has some type of autonomous control. Usually, if it can store a GPS flight track with it. There's different ways of sending this information back and forth. You can use Bluetooth, which is what a mouse uses most of the time. You can use the 2.4 gigahertz wireless communication. It's called Wi-Fi. Okay? It's how we're connected to the internet. And recently, DJI, the big manufacturer of drones, came up with something called LightBridge. And if you're familiar with the computing terminology, what happens in LightBridge is that they've disabled the handshaking, the TCP control in the communications, so there's no check on the bytes that are coming, and they can go up to 5 kilometers away. It's a pretty long distance. Some of the drone manufacturers now are enabling the user to control this drone through cell communications. So effectively, it's unlimited. You can send a drone as far as the battery will allow it to go. Manned aircraft versus UAS. If you think about this, what can a drone do that a manned aircraft cannot do? Okay. Manned aircraft have been used for a long time to carry sensors like cameras and other sensors, across the landscape to gather photography, to gather different kinds of laser information or thermal information. What can an unmanned aerial system do that a manned aircraft couldn't do? And there really isn't a lot, except with the drone, you can do it because is there anybody here that has a pilot's license? You can legally fly a plane. Pilot, you have a pilot's license? No. The pilot's license take a little bit of effort, to get a license to do that. Okay? And then you have to play by the rules, so to speak. I've always in my career used this term faster, better, and cheaper. Okay? When I was working with NASA many years ago, about 25 years ago, I was writing proposals to help them out. And they would tell me, Mike, you've got to be able to tell us something is faster, or it's better, or cheaper. If it's not faster, better, and cheaper, then why should we do it? So if you think about drones, are they faster, or are they better, or are they cheaper than a manned aerial system? Faster? Faster than an aircraft with a pilot in it? No. Can you do things better? Well, there are some places that you can fly a drone that you cannot fly a manned aircraft. They're just too big. They have to be big to hold a man, right? They're just too big. How about cheaper? Yeah, drones are a lot cheaper. You know, getting a good drone to do your own mapping, costs you no more than €1,000. Okay. But I put down one other thing, and that's the legality. Okay? Flying a manned aircraft or flying an unmanned aircraft in any airspace, the developed world is always controlled. Okay? So there are differences in cost. I'll show you a couple differences in capabilities. But then there's the legal characteristic of it. And that's the big impediment today, although it's getting much better in certain countries for flying. Okay, so here's a magic number I want to give you. This is true in the United States. I don't know if this is true, what the number is in Italy. Eugenio, do you know? Can you fly a drone higher than 400 feet or
meters?
150 meters, 200 meters? No. Legally?
Legally. Up to 150 meters, yes.
Okay, so 150 is your threshold in Italy. Okay. In the United States, it's 400 feet. Okay. So you can fly a drone up to 400 feet, legally. You can't fly more than 400 feet unless, there's always special considerations. Okay? But for the most part, think about 400 feet as a limit. 500 feet and above is where the manned aircraft fly. They always fly at that altitude or higher, except when they're taking off from an airport or landing. So the airspace below 400 feet is the domain of drones or unmanned aerial systems. I'm going to show you a few uses of unmanned aerial systems, and I'm going to do this from kind of a popular point of view. I'm not going to get too much involved in the science behind what each application is. Okay, they range from research applications to management applications. These are some. I put these in here because there's lots of things that if you go on the web, you find lots of things you could do with the drone. Okay. Yeah, and some things you may not want to do. Okay, I find the idea of drone racing extremely interesting, but incredibly dangerous. So this guy has tried to pick his drone up while the rotors were turning on it. This actually is a fire department which developed a flamethrower on a drone. Okay, and the idea behind this is that if there was some material on a transmission line, electrical line, somebody's kite got on it or something, and they didn't want that material there, they would launch their drone with a flamethrower on it, and it would burn off the material. It's a weapon, okay, on a drone. I'll talk a little bit about the domestic use of drones for security purposes, and then I'll talk more about the research applications for it. So we have an agency in the U.S. called the U.S. Customs and Border Security. And the job of this agency is to keep things that we don't want from coming inside the United States. Okay? And historically what that has meant is that means illegal immigration that comes in. And most of that's coming into the United States is from Mexico and from the Central America region. You guys know all about this, from the recent influx of immigration from Libya, for example. But historically, we've had a lot of drugs that come in from the Central America. And so the U.S. Customs and Border Security, what they want to do is to control this. They want to know who's trying to come in, and then they want to go in and try to stop them. This is, to my knowledge, the longest undefended border in the world. Okay, it's the border between Canada and the United States. There are border crossings, but anybody could effectively walk across the border because of the relationship that we've had historically with Canada. U.S. Customs and Border has a number of predators. I think it's 14 large. These are the large predator systems that were developed for the military. And these systems only carry sensors on them to detect things like people and boats and other aircraft. They have a sensor called the Wide Area Sensor that basically has a 35-kilometer viewing area, and it could automatically detect the movement of any object, whether it be a person or whether it be a ground vehicle. Okay. So the products that come out of the Predator drones are radar and real-time video. This is your Predator. Okay. This is flown by the Minister of Defense in Italy. Okay.
Which is the height of flight?
The height?
Yeah.
I don't remember. These are, I think they're normally about 16,000 feet, so that would be 5,000 meters, 6,000 meters. Yeah. They can go high. I don't know what we call it, the ceiling, the maximum height of the parachute. I don't know what that is. They're flown a lot because NASA has 2 of them at Ames, Iowa, in California, and they fly thermal and visible imagery during wildfires. I don't know the maximum height of that. Has anybody seen these? Seen your Italian versions? Okay. They're there, really high. Okay, so corridor mapping is one of the applications which is ideally suited for drones. Okay. And you can think of a corridor as being a stream, a river, the Edile River, for example. You can think about it as being, a gully in the landscape. It could be a transmission line. Okay. It could be a pipeline, telecommunication line. But the interesting thing about corridor mapping is it's typically long, it's narrow, and it's not straight. Most of the time it has all sorts of curves in it. Okay. So it's the ideal kind of application to fly a drone over, much more so than flying a manned aircraft, except for a helicopter, and helicopters are extremely expensive to fly. This is one application which is used almost by not every county in the United States. We have 3,200 counties, but it's an application area in which every county in the U.S. has a landfill. It's like the landfill you have at Estee or in other places where material that can't be recycled is carried and it's buried. In the United States, the operators of the landfill, usually a private company, have to apply for a license. And the license that they're given allows them to store a certain amount of material. And when they've stored all of that material, their license is done, finito. So they have to apply for a new one. It takes 5 years to apply for and receive a new license. And so they have to constantly monitor how much material they're putting inside of a landfill. And the way they've done this in the past, they've used surveyors in the field with a total station. Okay. I have 2 total stations. In fact, Sylvia and Paolo have used these when they've come to the South Carolina. You send somebody out and another person holding the prism, and you take measurements of, could be a very large landfill area. Now you can't do every single place on the ground, so you have to strategically choose places to come up with an estimate, okay, to build a terrain model of the landscape. Well, drones have become extremely popular to use because they meet a lot of criteria. They're flying over a private land space. There's no people below them. They can fly low to the ground unobstructedly. Okay, this actually is a colleague of mine in the Richland County landfill, which is the county our university is at. This is another county in Wisconsin, landfill. So they have to fly the drones. They can collect a point, an elevation point on the ground every few centimeters. So they can build an extremely detailed terrain model of what that landscape looks like at the moment that the drone is flying. And if they compare that to what the landscape looked like a year ago or 2 months ago, then they can subtract one from another and come up with a change in elevation. And then they can easily derive volume from that.
Do they work with photogrammetry or LiDAR?
Well, LiDAR is expensive. Yeah.
Yeah, usually.
It's an interesting question, Paul, because up until about 5 years ago, there were companies that were trying to come into the marketplace by flying a LiDAR on the aircraft to do this. The landfill operators, to them to contract for a LiDAR instrument to fly over, was many thousands of dollars. Okay? And so for them, it wasn't as efficient as just sending some surveyors out in the field. So LiDAR could do the job, but it's too expensive. So the drones that are flying now, they're flying aerial imagery. Okay, it's either video or still imagery. Most of them are videos, but then they take every other frame off of the video. And then they use the same principle. Well, I shouldn't say the same. The world of photogrammetry, which is the orientation of stereoscopic images that overlap together, okay, that world has merged with the computer vision world. Okay? And if you know the acronym called SFM, Structure for Motion. That's those two algorithms that are put together that allow the imagery from a drone, which is, so many images like all of them overlap with each other. You can create a three-dimensional model out of it. Most of it's automatic. Okay? There's some control points that have to be on the landscape to control the entire model. Okay? That help answer, Paul? Okay. Drones are being used a lot in many different kinds of construction projects now. Drones are used to initially do the reconnaissance for the project area so that a map can be created, its terrain model can be created, so we know what the landscape looks like before they do the modification. And during the construction process, a drone will be flown again and again. There are some requirements that the contractor who's doing the project has to document the traffic and parking issues that go along with it. And then the other one, which has become, drones are being used more, is these kind of damage events. Okay? When there's a flood event, there's an alteration of the landscape, they can quickly use a drone and fly over and collect information about the landscape much quicker and much easier than they could, and less costly than an aircraft. Okay, so this is the part that a drone can do that a manned aircraft can't do very well. And that's this concept of inspections. Drones are used to inspect large construction projects like dams. They can go underneath a bridge and look at the characteristics of a bridge. They're used a lot by the residential contractors in the United States that put roofs on houses. Okay? In the United States, the eastern United States, all of the roofs are asphalt shingles. They last about 25 years, and you have to take them off and put new ones on. So you look at the roofs to find out where there's apparent leakage. Okay? And when you see places where there's water going to come through, then you usually replace the whole roof. And so the contractors, they do this routinely. If you want an estimate of how much it's going to cost to replace your roof, I just replaced the roof on my house a couple of years ago. It was $10,000 what it cost. The contractor will come out and they will estimate for free. Now, I don't know what it costs for an estimate here. Probably you just had this done, an estimate done for the roof.
Yeah, I think with the man working on the roof.
Did they do it for free?
No,
You pay for the estimate. It's free in the United States because they're hoping to get your business. Okay? And so now, in the past, they would bring their ladders, they would climb on top of the roofs. We have some really steep roofs as you go north in the U.S. because of the snow. The roofs are deep. And so now they come out and they fly a drone. They fly a drone over, which gives them imagery. They can show you the imagery. They can detect leaks really easily. Okay? And it's fast and cheap for them. We have a number of federal laws which protects the habitat in the United States. You have some that come out of European Union requirements here in Italy. We have a lot of them. Some of them have to do with wetlands. And so it's routinely used now that drones are used over some of the wetlands habitat to characterize a wetland which has been restored or remade, to compensate, to mitigate for some damages done by an agency somewhere else. Okay? So for instance, Sylvia and I worked a lot with our Department of Transportation in the U.S. And when they build a new road or they widen a road, they can cover up wetlands. And so when they cover up wetlands, those are called impacts. And if they cover up, 2 hectares of wetlands, they have to recreate 2 hectares of wetlands somewhere else. Okay, and this is a wetlands restoration. I think this also is in Wisconsin. And so this area was recently flown, and DMs, digital elevation models, vegetation health was made using some near-infrared sensors on this. There's the red edge near IR sensor. And the spatial resolutions are incredible, 3 centimeters. There's a number of efforts in the United States to count the endangered species of birds, avian habitat. And there's 2 different examples here. One is this anthill crane, which was on a threatened of extinction about 20 years ago. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would like to know how many of the sandhill cranes are at different nesting locations. And so this is a nesting location in Colorado. It's actually not in the mountains. It's on, it's on the floodplain area where the sandhill cranes come. And in this example, this is the U.S. Geological Survey. They fly a fixed-wing aircraft called a Raven. Okay, they've been doing this for several years. And they'll fly the aircraft, over the study area and collect the imagery. Okay, so in this particular, this is a nighttime. Actually, this is the daytime collection, but they fly nighttime with a thermal camera as well on the Raven, and they can count, the sandhill cranes real easily because there's a difference between their thermal signature, their heat they're emitting, and the snow. Okay, so they do this in the winter, so it's real easy to get a very accurate estimate. In fact, this example, there's 14,000 cranes at this one wildlife refuge that they flew in 2012. Here's another example. This is the American pelican, and this is in actually Nevada, which doesn't have a lot of water resources, but this happens to be one of the islands in a lake in Nevada in which the American pelicans go and they nest. And this is also using the same Raven fixed-wing aircraft with both color and color infrared imagery. And the little red dots that you see here, these are individual pelicans. Okay? And so this is a combination project from the U.S. Geological Survey and a graduate student doing his master's thesis at Humboldt State University. The graduate student developed some algorithms to automatically pick out every single pelican in the imagery. Okay? In the USGS, they flew their aircraft to gather all the data. So this is a routine process that let's see a bunch of pelicans here. There's a routine process that they use to inventory the number of sandhill cranes or the number of pelicans and some other endangered species. Okay. The drones, like the Raven, has almost no sound associated with it, so it doesn't frighten, the wildlife. A big fixed-wing aircraft would have a different impact. You guys know about landslides probably more so than we do in the United States. We do have landslides, particularly in the western U.S., somewhat frequently. This is the West Salt Creek landslide that occurred 3 years ago. You can see the movement of the material here. USGS, again, they used a quadcopter here to fly over, collect high-resolution elevation data and imagery to document what the environment looks like. Now you can think about drones as being the modern quadcopters and octocopters or the fixed wing planes that were used a lot in the past. But in the United States, even something like a kite is considered to be an aircraft, and it's also regulated by the federal government. Okay? And this particular application was near, there was a major fault break in 1983 near Bora Peak. It's the highest, Bora Peak is the highest mountain in the state of Idaho. I tried to climb it 4 or 5 years ago and didn't quite get to the top of it. But there was a fault break there, okay, a pretty large fault break. And what they're doing here, they're creating a map of in an elevation model of the plane of the terrain surface. And they're using a kite, okay, a tethered kite, because they got it on a string with a camera on the bottom of it. Okay. There's something like, what did I get the number? 347 police departments in 43 states that are using drones now for different applications. That's as of April of this year. Okay. So this is a very sensitive topic in the United States, and I think it's more so in countries like Germany, when law enforcement is using drones to surveil, the landscape. People are afraid of that. Okay. Would you like the policia to be able to fly over your yard and take pictures of you? Is that a good thing? Gina doesn't like that.
I don't like that at all. You like it?
Phil and I were watching a video, interviews of people the other day about the cameras. You have a lot of cameras. It uses a lot for controlling speed. I know that very well. But they were interviewing a lot of people, and most people were concerned about this one park.
Yes, it was news on news, the local channel made in Vicenza.
In Vicenza, yeah.
I think so.
One person at the very end, he said, no, privacy is more important, than surveillance, for, these are people that were causing some problems in there. But, okay, but the fact is law enforcement is using these a lot. They get a lot of resources from the Department of Homeland Security, and it's fashionable now to buy these things. And so they're using those for everything from, a crime scene, like there was a fire. The question is, who caused the fire, or was it a natural fire? Is there a hazardous spill? Okay, and some kind of hazardous spills, you don't want to send a human out there unless he's protected in some way, so you send a drone out. This is used a lot when there's a crime suspect who's on the ground that he's moving, is to fly over him with a drone. And some applications for traffic management. Okay. You've probably seen the news, the advertisements from Amazon and DHL. Okay. The idea is that they can deliver your package within 30 minutes of you ordering it, okay, to your home with a drone. Now, I can't imagine what it would cost to do this. Okay. I imagine right now the cost is pretty high. I don't know if it'll get cheaper or not. Okay. Both of these companies have actually tested and delivered packages in England. England is really favorable to this. I think there was like 60 packages already delivered by drones in DHL. Okay. This is the container that holds the package, so there's a limit on the size of the package. You can't really see the container here, but there's a container underneath the center of the drone, which would have the package on it. Tested in Germany a lot. There's proposals in the U.S., Austria, and France. Amazon has submitted proposals to the federal and state governments to allow them to deliver packages. To my knowledge, it's not yet permitted in any other place except for England. Is it permitted in Italy? Would you order something from Amazon by drone? Wouldn't work very well in an urban area, would it? Like Padova. But in Colonia, out in the middle of the foreign, the landscape, it might work okay. Okay, so let me talk about legal issues of flying a small unmanned aerial system. Okay. In the United States, these were enormous. It was basically, you couldn't do it. Okay. One of my colleagues actually is in the GeoSciences department in the University of South Carolina. He was our test case. We had him write up an application for what's called a 333 waiver that allowed him and his students to fly a drone. And it was like 300 pages of documentation on the persons who would fly it, the drone itself, the characteristics of it, where he would fly, when he would fly. And at the very end, when he submitted it that summer, the Federal Aviation Administration, this is our governing body, they changed the rules and it makes it much easier to fly. Okay, so our federal government has one agency called the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, and they restrict the flying of anything in what's called the national airspace. That's the name that we use, the national airspace. What's an aircraft? Any device that is used for flight. That's what the Federal Aviation says. If the thing can fly, a balloon, an unmanned aircraft, then it's an aircraft. And if it weighs over 5.55 pounds, half kilogram, then you have to register it. Where can you fly? Anywhere where aircraft can safely navigate is called national airspace. If an aircraft can safely navigate, that's part of the national airspace and it's regulated. Now, one place you might think of flying a drone or any kind of aircraft which is not national airspace is inside a covered roof. Inside a building, you can fly a drone, and our Federal Aviation Administration, they say, you can do what you want. That's not our airspace. And so it's kind of interesting because you could put a big net over the landscape or over a football stadium, and suddenly you can fly drones legally in there. Okay, so the definition that our agency used potentially means anything above the ground of your property is the national airspace, and they regulate it. All right, so when can you fly? There are restrictions on when you can fly a drone, and it depends upon where you're flying. It also depends upon what other kind of activities are occurring. And then this is a really interesting and a very controversial topic, and it depends upon why you're flying. okay, which makes it legal or illegal in the U.S. If you're flying it for recreational purposes, okay, if you give it to your son, okay, or if you decide to take the toy away from your son and fly it yourself, okay, if it's for recreation, a hobby, it can be legal. If you're flying it for commercial, like you want to make money with it, or if you're flying it as a professor, then it's not legal, okay? You have to do special things. Okay? All right, so where can you fly? Okay, here's a diagram of where you can legally fly a drone, okay, an unmanned aerial vehicle, most of the time, okay? This area here in yellow, okay, which is 400 feet, okay, from the ground to 400 feet above the ground. You can fly a drone there legally. Okay? You can't fly it within 5 miles of an airport. Okay? Can't do that. Okay? And then as you go higher in the atmosphere, this zone of restricted airspace becomes larger and larger because the aircraft are coming into land or they're taking off. Okay? So think about, 400 feet above the landscape, that's your areas of opportunity. Now, I shouldn't say you can't fly within a city and you cannot fly within 5 miles of an airport. You can with something called a waiver. Okay? That's the special thing that you have to request to get that. Okay? You cannot fly over other people and you can't fly in any kind of park, okay, unless you have special permission. When can you fly? Well, you can't fly at night. It's cool. The drones have all these neat lights on them. You can see them go through. You can't legally do that unless you have special permission. You cannot fly over sporting events. This is our football in the United States, a college football stadium. You can't fly 1 hour before or 1 hour after the sporting event, anywhere near that sporting event, because people are coming and people are going. It's dangerous. You can't do that. So, in summary, what's regulated in the U.S.? Okay, anything over 0.55 pounds, even if it's tethered like a balloon, you have to register it. You cannot fly near airports or sporting events. You have to fly below 400 feet above the ground, and you cannot fly over human beings is the legal terminology that's in the legislation. You cannot fly 1 hour before or after a sporting event. Okay, you have to fly in the daytime. And unless you have something called a certificate, you can only fly for recreational purposes. Okay? Now, what this means is if you're flying for recreational purposes, you're not making money. And so we have a large group of people in companies